So here we are again. And we move to our last session, which is mass politics. And our first speaker is Brian Porter-Szucs. Thank you.
Although my wife tells me that I still can't say the vowel.
Porter?
No, yeah. her name is Szucs. I was a Porter, so we became a Porter-Szucs. And that vowel is like one of the 14 Hungarian vowels. Unpronounceable.
But it's not the long end.
It's two little dashes.
It's the current.
Is it the lines or the dots?
The lines.
Oh, yeah, there's lines.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Such.
So it's an umlaut.
An umlaut with an exclamation.
Yeah, that's it.
Is this called mass politics or politics of the mass?
Well, actually, it's, I guess I have to confess to.
There we go.
Good start, okay. That this is taken from my last book, which is called Faith in Fatherland, and it's the one political chapter in the book, which I sort of derived the paper from that because I heard the title of the conference. Although that's almost disingenuous because I really didn't want to write a book about politics at all. I also didn't want to write about anti-Semitism anymore either, but you can't avoid that. Not when you're writing about Polish.
I think there are some of your colleagues who managed to write books.
Yeah.
Is that not the case? Our mind is really
But no, I mean, and one of the reasons I say I didn't really want to write about politics is that one of the sort of grounding of the project out of which this emerged was a recognition that we've been in the field of religious history and religious studies. We went for a very long time in which the only way we could talk about religion was to reduce it to something else. So you would talk about the performance of religious rituals. You would talk about the political ramifications of religious practice. You would explain religion in some way. Right? You had to explain it, and what explain meant was finding out what they're really doing. Because of course, it can't be about God, right? That we don't. Since we don't believe in that anymore, then we will assume that everybody else has some sort of other motivation. So, what do they really want? And politics is a really. I don't pretend that
In the corner.
moving on. And politics has actually been a prime vehicle for doing that. That religion is, in the modern era, religion is a means of expressing a political position. Or if a person is making a doctrinal claim, well, what's the politics at work here, right? And I really didn't want to deal. I didn't want to go there. I wanted to write a book about the history of faith. And religious thinking, qua religious thinking, without bracketing whether it's real or not. I mean, that's irrelevant to me, at least in this context. And so I did try to do that, though, because I figured that in a political context, by kind of turning this around and saying, what is the faith behind the politics? Right? And specifically dealing with the concept of the nation as it was reflected in Catholicism. And what I started finding very, very quickly as I began this project a decade ago, that it wasn't anything that I had expected to find. The first thing that I found, and that people are still surprised to hear, is that the Polish Church, the Catholic Church in Poland, was not supportive of the national movement at all. There were priests priests who were. But it took a great act of courage for a priest to support the national movement right up until the very end of the 19th century. Because earlier on, the Roman Catholic Church's positions towards nationalism, it's well known in the Italian context, right? That of course the church, the giving up the papal states was a problem, and that the Catholic Church was opposed to the Italian national movement, taken as a given. It therefore should have been a surprise that people believed that it would work differently in Poland. It did not work differently in Poland. That from the Vatican down through the upper clergy, the hierarchy in Poland itself, for almost the whole 19th century, the attitude was nationalism is contrary to some basic principles of the faith. The primary one being this concept of legitimacy. And this is where a sort of faith politics comes into play. The sort of political theology of the Catholic Church was one which was based on a fundamental understanding of the relationship between the divine and the social. And this is still present in Catholic teaching today, although it manifests itself in a different way. That is, that if God created the world, God also created the way we live in the world. And that God's will governed our social structures just as much as anything else. If we tried to change that, we were violating God's will. So that stated in that bold fashion was the earlier stance that you would find right up through Pius IX, so right up until 1870. There's a passage in the book of Romans, chapter 13, where it says, "Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." If there is authority, God established it. Period. He who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. So that's in the scriptures. In 1832, Pope Gregory XVI issued an encyclical, Cum Primum, about the Polish national movement and its uprising against the Russian Empire. And in that encyclical, he did it in 1832, so waited until it was all over and then condemned it. Maybe he was hedging his bets, I'm not sure. But he said there that the obedience which men are obliged to render to the authorities established by God is an absolute precept which no one can violate, except if by chance something is commanded which runs counter to the laws of God or the church. And that pretty much summed it up. At that point, so far, the Tsar hadn't done the sort of things that, say, the French revolutionaries had done. Or the Josephinian reforms in the Habsburg Empire. That you could rebel against because there was an attack on the church. It was okay to rebel against that, but on national grounds, no, you could not. In my paper I give a bunch of examples from within Poland of the Polish hierarchy affirming in very strong terms this line. And in fact, one Archbishop Zygmunt Felinski, now Saint Felinski, in 1863, in the midst of another insurrection, spoke out vehemently against it and said that he recapitulated this line about always obeying unless a sin is commanded of you, but he went further. He said, quote, "Regardless of the internal content of the order, unless a sin is demanded, but even then, only passive resistance is appropriate, combined with the respect that a good son would show an insane father who issues an inappropriate order." So, you submit to the Tsar, period. If you look at church affiliated periodicals throughout the 19th century, they are loyalist papers. They are not supporting of the nationalist movement. Attempts to sing hymns that had a nationalist revolutionary content, banned, and then banned again, and then banned again as it kept coming up. The parish, the people wanted to sing them, and the national movement tried to use the church. And this is where this church-national movement linkage came from. The national movement, many of whose leaders were actually very ambivalent about religion, wanted to use the church because they figured the Russian authorities would never invade a church. Tsarist authorities won't do that. That they didn't, they were wrong on that point. And it led to a very dramatic incident in which, in 1861, in which the local gendarmes did invade a church to chase, in the course of chasing some demonstrators. And what happened in response, though, was very significant. The churches were closed, all of them, saying that a church, not just a church, but the church, which a capital C, has been profaned by this action, and all of them will be closed. Here was an act of resistance from the church, but that's what it took to get that act of resistance. It took a violation of the sanctity of the church, a religious violation. This was actually happened during an, I don't know what to call it, not an interregnum, because it's not a key, not a king, but between two bishops. One had died, the next one hadn't been named yet, so there was a gap. And in that gap is when that closure of the churches was ordered. The churches were closed, so were the synagogues, in a statement of Polish solidarity. And this is Warsaw, where the Jewish community was very pro-Polish. And so were the Protestant churches in Warsaw as well. So, and that, when a bishop came into office, then following that, one of the first things he did was to reopen the churches. Mostly because he was horrified by the fact that they were doing something that the Jews liked. And so, that just will not do. He particularly infuriated at the funeral ceremony of his predecessor. There had been a ecumenical interfaith procession where every religious leader in the whole city participated in this funeral ceremony, and the new bishop said that was just way out of bounds. You're allowing schismatics and heretics and Jews, all of them, to come. Schismatics are Orthodox, heretics are Protestants, Jews too. Okay, so this was a position. It was there were, though, of course, a lot of parish priests, low-level clergy, who did try to get involved. But the raw numbers are, I guess, impressive. I don't know. 178 priests. One scholar counted them. Polish historians like to do that. And they counted up all the priests that they could find who had participated in the national movement in any sort of explicit way. 178 of them in the years 1830 to 1860, taking that generation. Right? And I actually would read that as kind of a small figure. In that time period, there were a total of about 7,500 clergy in the church at the time. So 178 is pretty minuscule. Now, once the January insurrection, the 1863 insurrection broke out, there were more, but there were about 320 priests that participated in that. I'm sorry. There were over 600 priests who were sentenced for activities related to the uprising. That's about it's a little over 10% of the priests that were currently active in the country. That includes monastic clergy as well. Although most of these people had been carrying out what they considered their sacramental duties, so they were hearing confessions and giving last rites to people before mass. And they didn't see that subjectively as an insurrectionary action, but the Tsarist authorities did see it as an insurrectionary action. This crackdown on the clergy actually led more priests to affiliate with the national movement. And it's only in those last few decades of the Russian occupation of Poland that you begin to see a movement of the church towards the national movement. But it's a very hesitant movement, and even up to the very end, any priest that signs up, that joins a nationalist organization, is doing so in defiance of their own bishop, and that's something that's very, very hard subjectively to do. I mean, you take an oath of obedience in the church. That's something very important to priests. So violating an order, direct order from a bishop, it generally leads to excommunication, certainly defrocking. And so it was a huge step. So you don't have that many people do it. Now, Where this all begins to change, where we begin to get the 20th century Catholic politics that allows the church to get very involved in politics. But by the 1920s, this had completely changed. Right? By the 1920s, there was an archbishop in the Senate until he was ordered by Rome to step down. There were priests that remained in both the lower and the upper house. There were the statements from the episcopate openly pushing for the election of certain parties and not other parties. And then, of course, after World War II, the stance of the Catholic Church to the communist regime is well known. So what changed? Well, what changed is actually less than what may seem to have changed. On the level of the political theology, beginning with that idea that the social order is given by God, that was subtly reinterpreted by Pope Leo XIII to mean in 1885 with encyclical Immortale Dei, in which he made the argument that we really don't care about the forms of governance as long as the content of the governance is Christian. And so that was read at the time and is still often read now as a big change. It was less of a change than it seemed to be. It certainly allowed an opening for Catholics to express their loyalty to the French Republic, for example, where previously they could not have done so. It was Leo who staged this, the rally for the Republic, where Catholics rallied around the French Republic for the first time. Eventually, into the 20th century, it would allow even Italian Catholics to reconcile themselves to the state, although only after Mussolini came. So you start with this idea that yes, the state and the authorities in the state are given by God and we must owe them authority, but it doesn't really matter what form that takes. So you can have an elected government, that's fine. We don't care about that anymore. You can have a president or a king, that's fine. We're going to abandon this old concept of legitimacy that is inherited only and accept this more modern concept of legitimacy. But we're still going to demand that we recognize the Christian form. So, the Christian substance, even with the difference in form. That is what would take us into the 20th century and would allow to accept elected governments as long as all those elected recognized that they could not adjudicate right and wrong. They could only adjudicate the application of right and wrong. So good and evil is established. We know what is good, we know what is evil, we know what is God's law. The legislature may come up with different ways of, different policies to advance those goals, but we know what they are, and the legislature cannot change right and wrong. They can only, and John Paul II said, you can't vote on right and wrong. So that remained true all the way through, and leading to a lot of disillusionment of Catholics after the fall of communism when they had free elections, and sure enough, people actually vote on things the church didn't like, and they had some problems with that. One of the big problems they had with that is that the new state, the new Polish state in 1918, did not get a Catholic constitution. And in fact, they had a constitution that proclaimed that everyone was a citizen of the state regardless of faith or ethnicity. Now, of course, we know in practice it didn't always work out that way, although it wasn't probably as bad as we expected. But, well, I'm thinking of, like all the neighboring countries except for Czechoslovakia, right? It came out not so terribly bad. And the state, and in the interwar years, the persecution and discrimination came from sometimes state officials, but mostly it was discrimination coming from non-state actors, universities, various movements, right? The official rules of the state, there was no anti-Semitic legislation, right? Except for one law about kosher slaughter, which was, but even that had to be cast rhetorically as if it weren't anti-Semitic, right?
And that's very late, though.
And it was very late,
37.
Yeah, 30. So anyway, so the church was very hostile to this new state, but they were able to participate in it because of this new theology of politics that allowed them to get involved so as to Christianize the state. That became the new mandate. Instead of an option, as in the 19th century, of we just won't engage in politics that is anything but legitimacy, right? Anything with any other type of politics we have nothing to do with. We will now engage. And the process of engagement drew them into alliances with the Polish nationalists because they had a lot in common. They had anti-Semitism being foremost among them. That were the two most prominent voices for sort of politicized anti-Semitism were coming from the hierarchy of the church and the national democratic movement, the far right. And and then of course opposition to socialism, which was seen as a far greater threat than the Orthodox Tsar or Protestant Kaiser ever could have been, right?
And
So,
not as bad as the Jews.
the Jews are the same thing.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Right. It's always Żydopomór, right? That's just, it's always the Jew conflict. It's one word. It is one word in Polish. I say it. One word. Yeah. And then at this time in the 1920s, we start to see a whole bunch of historical books being written by Catholic authors showing how the church has always been the bulwark of the nation. And therefore, rewriting the history of the 19th century, canonizing a lot of priests that had in fact been anathematized in their own day. Priests who had joined the national movement get rehabilitated subtly. These books about Catholic heroism, the church as the only site for the enactment of Polishness, a claim I've never been able to understand because in the church they spoke in Latin. There was they didn't have any Polish in church, so that was not a site of behaving Polishness. It was a site of behaving Catholicity, which is fine. But unless you buy that being Catholic means being Polish, which several other billion Catholics might have a slight problem with, unless just the act of being Catholic makes you Polish, then that's a strange claim. But in terms of supporting the national movement, they were there. But they made themselves there because, I would argue, of this essentially tactical alliance, which they were never comfortable with. They were never comfortable with at all because they felt that the nationalists were trying to nationalize Christianity instead of Christianizing the nation, and they didn't like that. And so they were very uncomfortable with the nationalists all the way through the interwar years, even as they supported them in elections as a tool against socialism, the minorities bloc, and the time that they're liberals.
Brian, are you hoping to get pizza? Okay. You
I actually was coming back.
So this is very interesting, but what I'm left wondering is whether the theological argument you provide as the basis for the non-nationalism of the Polish Church in the 19th century, whether that suffices. Thinking about the papers we heard this morning, which have to do broadly with institutional arrangements about disciplining, social order, and things like that. Now, I don't know what the relationship is of the Polish Church to the autocracy, but I wonder if some of these issues that came up this morning might apply in this case as well. And just one other example, the Armenian Church also was not nationalist at all, totally upset by the emergence of the Armenian parties in the late 19th century. So, on some level, it's not all that surprising.
No.
The Greek church was trying to stop the Greek Revolution.
Right. No, it's not. It's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising.
But I guess what I'm guessing, it's not only theology, it seems to me, it's also the fact that then there are competing authorities and competing claims for the loyalty of the same people when nationalist movements emerge.
Polish nationalist movement they were very careful not to be anti-clerical. There were some exceptions, but for the most part they tried to be careful about that, so as not to allow that sort of conflict to emerge. I mean, it did. Mickiewicz's work got placed on the index, the forbidden books, and some other nationalists were openly condemned that way. terms of seeing it as a conflict over authority.
Maybe I'm misremembering, but what about, how did the Catholic Church respond to how Russian officials were tried to use the Catholic Church for their own ends, right? Weren't there aspects of Russification through the Catholic Church going on? So how did they respond to that, and did that affect?
Great question. Vehemently, rigorously, and with a wall of determination.
But
So
still,
the minute you cross that church door, the minute you try to interfere, the nomination of bishops, the nomination of priests, all the stuff that led to all the problems during the Kultur conflict, right? Whenever Russia tried to do anything like that, whenever the Tsar tried to do anything like that, firm line. And I mentioned in the paper a guy, what's his name again? Rukovsky, I think, who was a bishop, not east somewhere, sorry, out west, in the borderlands region. He had stood very firm, banning, defrocking priests during the 1863 rebellion, and then just a little bit after that, when it was demanded of him that he allow the state to have a role in the nomination of priests, he not only refused, but he refused to the point of being arrested and exiled. So, you know, they had it in them to be very hostile to the state if the state tried to touch the church itself.
Sure, thank you. I think the general tenor of your argument is very convincing, but just to play devil's advocate for a moment, could you break it down?
So to speak.
Yeah, so to speak. Horrible Catholic. Could you break down for us, if you said you can, some of these numbers? I mean, the 7,000 is one number, but is that, you know, what does that mean? Is that everyone, is that retired priests living in directory, or is that, are those seminarians? I mean, so that's, because you thought 7,000 is a big number, but
Yeah.
if you took an age group of men who might actually be in a position to do something, would that number look different? And then, do your sources like to say more about what these activities are? I realize that, you know.
Yeah.
Is that actually, then if you were to find out parishes, I mean, could it be, again, just to push your argument, that, I mean, that certain priests at certain parishes are in fact on the barricades, are in fact, you know what I mean? In other words, during which, I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, not that 7,000 is strong, but could it be that you do have key figures, and perhaps a higher percentage of certain people of a certain age group in key parishes who are actually more integral to the movement than
I don't know about age. The 7,000 or 7,800, whatever that was, that is counting all the people ordained within a 30-year period and comparing it to all the priests identified as engaged in the national movement in an active way in that same 30-year period. So you're right, it will somewhat that, you know, I don't want to present this as like hard statistical evidence, but a sort of point of orientation. Sure. If we want to narrow it down by time to just the 1863 rebellion, so we have slightly over, I did read once a comparison of the rate of arrest of priests compared to the rate of arrest of adult males. And the priests
Of non-clericals,
Non-since
priests
are presumably adult males. Good point. Yes, right. In other words, to try to get a comparative, and in turn, and by from that author's work, and I don't even remember where I got this sort of an article in Polish. I think it might be footnoted in my paper, but the conclusion was that the priests were participating at a lower rate than the general population, at a much lower rate than the nobility. Probably at a higher rate than the peasants, I'm sure. But.
I have a quick question. To what extent the religious matters, and especially in relation to the Catholic Church within the Russian Empire, matter to the members of the Polish cohort in the Russian War?
Oh, the Polish coal, okay. The Russification of the word of intent. What? I'm teasing. Okay, so at that time, the leadership, when Roman Dmowski, when he he was quite anti-clerical. As a young man, declared atheist. He actually was always he never converted to Catholicism. So while he was in it, he was, let's see, I don't remember, he was elected to the third. So the first and second Duma, the dynamics would have been different. But generally speaking, the church was supportive of the idea because it was legitimate. But
I think there may have been a cleric actually among in the Polish circle in the Britain. I'm not positive it's something resonates.
Certainly possible, right. But I mean, they were not terribly engaged with it. I mean, in the sources, and I was looking at in sources inside the church periodicals, not too much discussion, much. So it wasn't an issue that was high on their radar.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the role of the cadets at the Christian Democrats vis-a-vis the National Democrats. Now,
the original coming out of World War I, when it became obvious that Polish independence would be restored, the episcopate wanted a cadet. They wanted a Christian Democrat, and they did not want to allow National Democrats assume that role, and so they did, creating such a party. It gained a great deal of support in Silesia, with which it co-founded, but nowhere else. And by the time they got around to the elections to the Constitutional Assembly, Constitutional Convention, were organized at different times in different regions, very chaotic, because the state didn't exist yet. And in some regions, the National Democrats ran on their own. In some regions, they ran in a coalition with the Hadecja, with the Christian Democrats. And very quickly after that point, the Christian Democrats realized that they had no chance electorally. And so they remained a separate party, but in moments of election, they joined a parliamentary circle that included the candidates.
Move on to Elena Campbell with the Muslim question, many Muslim questions, some Muslim questions. Well, as the title indicates, the focus on my presentation is on Islam, Muslims, and their participation in mass politics, but rather what was historically known as the Muslim question in late imperial Russia as the Muslim question, and as a developing set of ideas, what came to be called the Muslim question was, as I say in my paper, an elastic concept with various meanings and definitions. In most cases, though, Russians evoked its rhetorical power to articulate fears and anxieties as much about Muslims as about the state and themselves. So my work is the study of these cases. And by the Muslim questions, the bureaucrats, intellectuals, missionaries, and publicists meant the following. How should Muslims, who constituted 11% of the empire's subjects, be governed within a modernizing, multi-ethnic, and multi-confessional empire, one that had expanded significantly in the 19th century? And in my work, I suggest that in order to understand Russians' anxieties concerning Muslims, especially as they developed in late imperial Russia, we should first view them in relation to the contradictions of the autocratic modernization. And that's partially where I think is the answer lies to the question about the shifts in imperial policy of tolerance. So the contradictions of autocratic modernization and the convention's visions of its goals. And also second, I believe that we should place these anxieties and fears within an interconnected context of Russia's multi-confessional and multi-ethnic empire. So I should say that it's very interesting for me to be at this table at this particular moment in my life, in my career, because I became interested in the Muslim question many, many years ago when I was a student studying history at St. Petersburg State University in late 80s, early 90s. At the time when religion reemerged in Russian public and also private life, I still remember some of my classmates, the rediscovering I had a friend who continued actually going to Armenian church. I discovered that one of my grandmothers was an old believer, and it was my father, who was a communist, who had to come to terms with this discovery. So I had a lot of questions. I came to this Muslim question actually with interest in religious questions. But then I became more and more, I shifted my focus toward political history. But as I will show today, the religious issues were and remained at the center of my interest and were at the center of the Muslim question. So until its demise in 1917, the Tsarist Russia officially remained an Orthodox state governed by an autocratic ruler. Confession, as we know, was an important component of imperial subject identity and also an instrument of governance. Since the 18th century, as we know, limited religious tolerance has been one of the key principles of building multi-confessional empire. Moreover, as our colleague Robert Cruz has demonstrated, the state went further than just tolerating different non-Orthodox confessions, but it presented itself as a defender of officially tolerated faiths and institutionalized confession by creating special organs of religious administration and cooperating with religious elites. And this strategy was a successful strategy to a certain extent and secured the loyalty of the empire's Muslim subjects and provided very favorable conditions for further expansion of the empire to the east. But my focus here not on the success stories. My focus is on the tensions that characterize this confessional system. And here we come to the second important element of this imperial confessional system. It was hierarchical, with the Orthodox Church subjugated to the state, but officially occupying a dominant position. So one of its privileges was the exclusive right to proselytize within the empire. And according to Russian law, once baptized into Orthodoxy, and here we come to another important question that was discussed today a lot, the question of conversion. So new converts and their descendants were not permitted to change their confessional affiliation. So attempts to leave Orthodox Church were identified as apostasy. And the conversions of earlier periods, so Russian strategy toward Islam, in fact, was not the same since the 16th century, changed. So their earlier during the earlier periods, this conversions had created baptized communities of Finnish and Turkic-speaking populations of the Volga region, some of whom, by the early 19th century, submitted mass petitions for permission to revert to Islam. And thus the dominant Orthodox Church found itself in a situation of rivalry with officially tolerated Islam, but not only Islam. In the West, it was Catholicism, it was also Protestantism, and while simultaneously facing the difficulty of maintaining minority converts' loyalties. So governing the empire by means of this confessional system, in which the state attempted to be both the guarantor of Orthodox dominant position, but also protector of Islam, while also playing the role of supreme interpreter and arbitrator of conflicting interests, turned out to be a very difficult and challenging task, especially in the face of multiple challenges of cultural, social, and political modernization up to 1861. So although Russia had ruled a Muslim population since the 16th century, the Muslim question emerged within government circles and elite public opinion only in the second half of the 19th century, following Russia's defeat in the Crimean War of 1853 and 1856. And as historians have demonstrated, the Crimean War exposed the deficiencies of Nikolaevan regime, served as a catalyst for the great reforms, fundamental transformations of Russian social institutional order. Recently, scholars have also emphasized the impact of the Crimean War on the development of Russian nationalistic discourse, in which Orthodoxy occupied a prominent place. And as I suggest, the Russian defeat in the Crimean War, which actually took place on the empire's culturally diverse border regions, the Crimean Peninsula and Caucasus, also played a crucial role in bringing the empire's Muslim subjects and the problems of empire more generally to the center of public and government attention. Neither war rumors about Muslims' hostility to Russians or concerns about Muslims' trustworthiness were entirely new.
given the long history of the empire's multi-confessional society. What was new, though, was the way in which these issues were reconceptualized in the wake of the conflict. Only after the Crimean War did Russian educated society and the government discover and then became increasingly interested or concerned about what many came to perceive as the alienation of Crimean and Kazan Tatars from Russia, and the reported cases of Muslims' supposed treason during the Crimean War, mostly Crimean being Kazan Tatars, and the mass immigration to Turkey that followed the war and started during the war seems to support this view. So the great reforms put forward the agenda of enlightenment and social rapprochement, thus challenging the existing model of imperial governance, which privileged stability over social transformation, relied on cooperation with Muslim elites, used military force, like in the Caucasus, to suppress undesirable rumors or relocate troubled Muslim communities from the borderlands. Yet, the policy of integration faced some constraints. By so closely connecting faith with political allegiance, the discussion that developed after the Crimean War crystallized the problematic issue of Russia as an Orthodox state governing a multi-confessional empire. And those Russians who associated Russianness of Orthodox state, with orthodoxy, with patriotism, drove Muslims into intrinsic alien position, which was only fortified by anxieties related to another military campaign of 1877-78 against Turkey and Muslim popular resistance to the great reforms. And the continuous military expansion of the empire, the forceful inclusion of new Muslims into the imperial state, first in the Caucasus, but later in Central Asia, presented a challenge to these goals of imperial integration, while also intensifying fears of some Russian fears of Islam. So thus the experience of the Crimean War and the state-driven modernization during and after the great reforms of 1860s and 70s, but especially the contentious visions of its goals, among other factors, politicized anew the governing of empire's Muslims. And Russians' concerns about Muslims' place in this modernizing and expanding at the same time empire also developed in relation to other multiple questions that were formulated during 1860s and 1870s. And in particular, in my paper, I bring attention to the connection between the Polish question and the Muslim question. In fact, I see here that the Muslim question developed, so if one can say so, within the discursive framework of the early discussion on the Polish question. The Polish rebellion, and that's why for me it was extremely interesting to read your paper about the relationship between Catholicism and Polish nationalist movement, because in the eyes of those who problematized Muslims, the two were connected. So the Polish rebellion of 1863 crystallized the problem of imperial diversity, made some educated Russians observancy in Islam in eastern provinces of European Russia a force similar to a threat of Catholicism in the western borderlands. And what was interesting also to see how these fears were transmitted from one borderland to another by particular individuals who served in the western borderlands and then were transferred to the eastern borderlands and brought with them their understanding of religious issues that they experienced ruling empire in the western borderlands. And we see this connection actually not only in the second half of the 19th century, but I see this also in the the beginning of the 19th and 20th century. That's why I asked this question about the Polish circle.
Polish circle. We say coal.
Coal.
That's
coal, yeah.
just
Because there were also parallels in the minds of some officials between the Polish circle and the Muslim faction. And the fears that Muslims might get as radical in their demands as the Poles are. Moreover, all alien so-called questions, and there were other questions, of course, the Finnish question, the Baltic questions, everything was a question, and this is tiny, but all alien questions, whether Polish and Muslim, were closely intertwined with domestic problems Russia faced in modernizing its empire. And this was especially the case in terms of Russian concerns about the role and authority of Russian Orthodox clerics and the central place of the Orthodox parish, the so-called clerical and the parish questions. These were in in my at least, the story that I try to reconstruct were especially connected to the Muslim question and the Polish question as well. So the Great Reforms also redefined the long-standing issue of apostasy among baptized non-Russians from Orthodoxy to Islam, and most of these cases happen in the Volga-Ural region. That's Russia, where the Orthodox Church had its long history of missionary activity. So on the one hand, the reforms of 1860 stimulated the apostasy. On the other, the same reform in the climate, the reformist spirit of 1860s created favorable conditions for a group of reform-minded lay missionaries and their sympathizers within the church to emerge. And with the famous educator missionary Nikolai Levinsky as the center, as a central figure, this group suggested new perspectives and solutions to the problem of apostasy. So Levinsky came to the conclusion about the relative strength of Islam, because most of the clerics in this region have disregarded the strength of Islam, viewed Islam as just something inferior in relation to Orthodox, as a delusion, temporary delusion. So Levinsky actually brought a new point here that he had to defend. He also reformulated the immediate task of the church as one of stopping apostasy by instilling conscious religiosity among the already baptized, rather than just mechanically Christianizing Muslims, and in general, rather than Christianizing Muslims. So Levinsky thus brought a new, into this discussion of apostasy, a new view of Islam as a vital force. And so later, this view will be supported by this view of Catholicism. And a perspective that he also combined with a strong adherence to Orthodox belief and animosity toward traditional Islamic teaching. So while Levinsky's approach to apostasy, as I think was reformist in spirit, it's also developed within the existing confessional system, but at the same time presented a challenge to the official Orthodox Church. It redefined the nature of the Orthodox community in Russia by raising a series of questions about the role of lay people in church life, about the relationship between the priest and his parish, about the nature of the religious belief. So Levinsky discovered that Muslims in Russia seem to possess something what the Orthodox Church was missing, a vibrant religious community, and intensifying during the aftermath of the Great Reforms, Levinsky's missionary project, which grew out of his understanding of local Orthodox Muslim rivalries, offered a continual reminder of the urgent need to transform one of Russia's foundational institutions, the Orthodox Church. So as I already mentioned, these ideas, I think, were reformist in spirit, but they also suggested an alternative, Russian alternative to the Western European idea of progress, a unique Russian path to modern age. And what united Levinsky and many of his sympathizers within the church, government and public circles, was the emphasis they all placed on religion, the centrality of religion in a life of a society, and their views about the nature of religious belief and church life in Russia. And as one of Levinsky's best supporters, the Bishop of Ufa and Zelinsk Andrei Ukhtomsky, argued at the beginning of the 20th century, Levinsky essentially put into practice the program of Russian Slavophiles, for whom Russia's transformation had to begin from the bottom, with critical role played by a renewed popular orthodoxy rather than the traditional hierarchy alone. And so when the Muslim question was raised and discussed in public circles in the second half of the 19th century, also within the government, it was largely formulated as a problem of Muslim alienation. At the same time, however, with all these ideas developed by Levinsky, these discussions revealed a constant fear of Muslims, and particular Tatar domination. So Muslims were not only alienated, but were also dominating or stronger than the neighboring Christian population. Some in the government saw the solution to this problem through educational measures, which also preserved the existing confessional and political order, and therefore this regime's approach was contradictory. The same contradiction we see now from this time period, during this time period in regime's policy toward Muslim religious institutions. So within bureaucratic circles, the conviction grew that establishing official Islamic administration was a mistake, was a wrong policy, one that didn't correspond first with the spirit of the Great Reforms, and that might in fact help Islam to dominate orthodoxy in the eastern borderlands. The authorities were thus faced with a dilemma. How could Islam be controlled without institutionalizing it and consequently as adhered strengthening it? So as a result, plans for the unification of the existing system were shelved. In fact, there were many plans to create one because the system was not unified. Some parts of the empire had a religious administration, others not, and even these bodies were administering these religious issues differently. So there were plans during 1850s and 60s to unify the system, but nothing came out of it. While no ecclesiastical administration was created for Muslims in Northern Caucasus and Central Asia, so in Simferopol and Tiflis, however, the state-sponsored Islamic establishments were preserved, and the state here continued to rely on Islamic religious authority in its interactions with the imperial Muslim subjects. However, this approach appeared to be inconsistent and didn't please Ilminsky and other vocal supporters of Ilminsky. At the same time, this policy of relying on institutionalizing Islam and creating these institutions laid the foundations for claims made by Muslims, and especially during the era of mass politics and Duma politics, who appropriated state religious institutions and pressed the government to widen the limits of religious tolerance. The state also, as we know from works of Porter-Szucs and others, that failed to solve the problem of the Orthodox Church raised by the Great Reforms, while Ilminsky and especially his followers had to increasingly defend their views against both Russian and non-Russian opponents, as well as compete for state support with Muslims. So the debate on reform and how to govern Muslims, that became a focal point also for those living in Russia's multicultural regions, who sought to find their own ways to meet the new challenges they faced. And in fact, the empire itself became an arena in which various projects of reform, as well as claims for leadership and inclusion into imperial politics, came into contact and competition. And Ilminsky's vision of reform and empire was challenged, as we know, by a reformist project of Ismail Gasparinsky, the leader of the Jadids, a group of Muslim intellectuals who emerged in the second half of the 19th century. The Jadids saw themselves as reformers of their society, claimed leadership of their community, attempted to overcome the so-called backwardness of Muslims through the synthesis of cultural Islamic values with the achievements of the West. And the Jadids considered Islam as the basis for identity for Muslim community and often referred to Islam to justify the reforms. Both Gasparinsky and Ilminsky ideas represented, in my opinion, efforts to rethink the role and the nature of religion in face of pressures of modern age and the challenges of imperial rule. And both projects claim to aspire to better integration of Muslims into the empire. Both projects inspired followers, stirred opposition among their co-religionists, but there were also significant differences. In contrast to Gasparinsky, for example, who viewed progress as inevitable and desirable, Ilminsky was not optimistic about the path of European progress for Russia's future. So it's not surprising that Ilminsky and his followers were among the first ones who became threatened by the Jadids, interpreted the challenges presented by them as a complication of the Muslim question, which was already complicated. There's a problem of alienation by peer domination. But the government officials, especially within the MVD, who were mostly concerned with imperial, social order within the country, were not concerned about the Muslim questions, especially the political aspect of it, until the beginning of the 20th century. So, in fact, after the revolution of 1905, so the political mobilization of Russian society and Tsar's concessions, especially in the early 20th century, set the Muslim question in a new context. So the new freedom of speech and association and the extensions of voting rights empowered Muslims and created opportunity for Jadidism to transform into a liberal political movement. The Jadidi's ideas constituted the platform, as we know, for Muslim Duma faction, which allied with Russian liberals like the Constitutional Democrats. From the perspective of Russian educational elite who were attempting to understand the Muslim question, the most important aspect of the Muslim political awakening was its explicitly religious character. I think it was the only faction that was based on confession confession exclusively. Others were based on either party affiliation or nationality. So the Muslim movement, of course, was not unanimous in its political outlook, but the existence of the Muslim faction nevertheless suggested an aspiration among Russian Muslims, especially Tatars, for a broadly united Muslim front. So the Tatar and Azeri delegates in the Duma claim to represent the interests of all Muslims in Russia, regardless of class and locality. In their opinion, Muslims constituted a single national group, united by common religious culture. The leader of the first, especially, faction, the leader of the Muslim faction in Duma, Dabchibashev, an Azeri lawyer and also editor of the Russian language newspaper Kaspi, later wrote that the empire's confessional order preconditions the mobilization of Russian Muslims into the old Muslim liberation movement. The official recognition of Islam legitimated religion as a mobilizing tool used by Muslim intelligentsia whose real goals were essentially national and political. Meanwhile, as supporters of Levinsky, by this time Levinsky was already gone, Bishop Andrei complained there was no faction within the Duma which would defend Orthodox community interests, understood in a Slavophile way. So here the competition already went into between Islam and Orthodoxy, developed in a already different way. So to Russian reform-minded Orthodox observers, Muslims seem to be more successful, although the Russian government didn't think that Muslim faction was really that successful in mobilizing Muslim population, but in the eyes of Levinsky supporters, Muslims were more successful in mobilizing themselves, and especially to press for their needs, for their religious needs, to press the government. The Muslim political awakening, however, did mobilize Levinsky followers, and to the Muslim congresses, for example, they responded with a missionary congress in Kazan in 1910. Levinsky followers viewed Gaspritsky's and his followers' nationalism as artificial project, which forcefully drew into its orbit neighboring non-Russian and non-Muslim communities, while also representing Muslims' conscious alienation from Russia. And in their view, this situation became only worse as the government, after the promulgation of the 1905 Decree on Tolerance, which sparked mass transfer of apostates to Islam. So viewed now in light of Muslim political movement and Muslim political awakening, the mass conversions appeared to Russians as a part of a larger Russian Muslim Tatar nation-building project. So, and as we know, under the pressure of revolution, the government agreed to reforms by introducing a limited form of democracy, expanding religious tolerance, but without dismantling the hierarchical confessional system, and offering concessions in language policy, but even so, these concessions appeared to fall short of the expectations of Muslim liberals, who challenged the official notions of religious tolerance and rapprochement. And more importantly, they confronted Russian society and government with new types of claims, insisting that the Muslim community be viewed as a nation with distinct interests and rights, rather than as a tolerated alien confessional group. So in effect, they reformulated the Muslim question as the problem of intersecting interests of the empire's various nationalities.
Are you
So,
concluding?
yeah, I'm concluding. Yeah. So, what could be the conclusions here that I can make? Well, the contours and the contradictions of this Muslim question revealed, as I'm trying to show here, the fundamental dilemma of transforming an imperial, autocratic, and orthodox state while also keeping its bearing structures intact. That's the main story, I think, of the Muslim question. Central here were also the tensions embedded into the empire's unique confessional system. So one was the conflict between the regime's commitment to privileging orthodoxy and the limited tolerance in this particular case toward Islam. A no less difficult problem was the state's need, and officials really believe that that's what they had to do, to satisfy Muslims' religious needs, the just religious needs, while also preventing Islam and its official religious institutions from becoming the tools of nationalistic and political propaganda. And this became especially difficult to do during this era of mass politics. And as the state itself increasingly adopted nationalistic rhetoric, it became even more difficult to pursue both agendas. But the debate on the Muslim question also demonstrated the extent to which confessional differences became explicitly nationalized. The story of the Muslim question also reminds that the Russian perceptions, and policies toward Islam should be studied in relation to other confessions. Catholicism is one of them, but also the Orthodox Church and also the Old Belief, because many of the characters who, in my study, who wrote on the Muslim question looked not only at Islam as a model for developing parish life, for instance, in Orthodox, but also Protestant Church, but also, and especially the Old Believers. In fact, one of the main characters of my story at the end, not at the end of my story, but during already a different period of joining the Old Belief, I was before priest. And also, the debate on the Muslim question also shows that Russian perceptions and fears of Islam were not static, but conditioned by the historical circumstances and the political situation. I give example at the end of my paper how one of the main writers on the Muslim question in the early 20th century radically changed his view, at least the way they were expressed publicly. And finally, the different understandings and solutions to the Muslim question, as I believe, played an important role in exacerbating the crisis of the autocracy. That is, discussions about the nature of the question and how to solve it both reflected and further contributed to the paralysis of the Tsarist political system. I guess I'm not the optimist here about the autocratic system and its potential to survive. And in the story of the Muslim question, I see how the participants themselves, the followers of Yaminsky, those Muslim liberals, and certain personalities within the government developed conflict about different interpretations of the Muslim question that they formulated. Okay.
Comments on this respect?
Honestly, I had this crazy idea and started poll reading among Jews. Big reading, yeah, among Jews. Yeah. And actually, in the early 20s, when they joined the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which supplied Zionist settlers, communist settlers, people at Yorkshire. It's a story. But what I'm trying to say.
I've seen lots of pictures.
Yes, they won the competition as the best pig breeders, the best pig breeders in the Crimea from the colony Tel Hai. But I was trying to look into the Muslim paradigms, and I failed to find any examples, even during the entire Soviet period. From what I could see, so this idea that you mentioned how strong this or that was the easiest actually for the Soviet, for example, it was the Jewish religious life. The Christian and then the Muslims, they had many problems. My question is, in your discussion with the state, missionaries, the church, and what are insight they need reforms? Because what made the Jewish case easier, because there were many insights. Actually, the number was enough to spare, because many of them went to deal among the Muslims, Jewish, to represent the communist state, to represent the communist party. What did happen inside? Were there any intellectuals or any reformers or significant number inside the Muslim community that were trying to secularize, to transform their religious life?
Yeah, well, I was talking about, I don't know if that's the answer to your question, I was talking about the judges who were not, I guess, trying to secularize the life of Muslims, but combine Islam with Western ideas, and these were their project of reform of their own society came into competition, as I say, with projects of reform that were suggested by Orthodox missionaries or government officials, but especially the Yaminsky followers, because they viewed this project also as they called it intelligentski progress, but also as a nation building project. But this project, as I said, always spurred opposition. It didn't find a lot of actual support, only mostly in urban centers. And something that later Jadid's movement was politicized, and the Muslim faction within the Duma very much borrowed many of these ideas, but even they were, in my opinion, which is based mostly on the reports of the Russian officials, but also other studies of Muslim reformist movement in the Russian Empire, and were not very successful in widely spread as it appeared to some of the missionaries in these multi-confessional, multi-ethnic regions.
External rather than internal.
Well, but this movement was not external. It was internal. Ligastinsky was a Crimean Tatar, and he was also Muslim, he was also a believer, but his understanding of religion was different, and he wanted to integrate Muslims into the Russian Empire, but on different foundations. In fact, his project threatened not only fell into competition also in a different area, also in Central Asia, because Vespinski's ideas also in himself traveled to Central Asia, reached as far as Central Asian Muslims, and that's where Russians viewed Vespinsky and Tatars in general as competitors for civilizing local Muslims. So that's where it was another area of competition. So Vespinsky, one could say, and that's how Russian officials claim, was external influence for Muslims, say, in Central Asia. They claimed that the Crimean experience could not be applied, and a special Tatar experience, to Central Asian Muslims, and especially our population. But it depends, I guess, how we view the reform, but I would consider this as an internal movement that developed within a larger framework of empire and the Muslim world, larger Muslim world. And Zaid Khalid connected his ideas more to the larger Muslim world, but there were also definitely influences and connections that are important here within the empire.
I'm obviously intrigued when you make the parallel to the Western borderland, but what puzzles me, and this is a question I've always had, sometimes you can answer it, I don't get why the Russian state was so concerned with the clergy. Yeah, I mean, you said that they took their models for governing the southern borderlands from their experience in the western borderlands, but that experience in the western borderlands doesn't line up with what actually happened. In other words, there's this perception, it seems to be, that both the Muslim question and the Catholic question exist in some sense, those that they exist in the minds of Russian officials in a way that's pretty radically disengaged from what's actually happening in the territories. You guys are nodding your heads. and I guess I just don't understand where that comes from.
Well, I would say that what was transferred was not the experience of governments, but the anxieties. That's what was transferred. At least that's what I traced as a transfer. And for instance, I give some examples. One was this Kazan Archbishop Antonia Amphithéâtre, who came from Smolensk. His report was in Kyiv in the 1860s. The director of the and for 2 weeks, there were turbulent times. He came to Kazan and saw in Islam, rising spirit of Islam, that's how he wrote his reports to the government, threats similar to Catholicism, and he thought that the policy, restrictive policies to Islam should be similar to the ones that were applied to Catholicism. He thought that Islam actually was treated quite quite liberal way, but actually didn't have. So there were also other examples of this, comparisons. For the later time period, I already mentioned one, the Polish group within the Duma gave similar peers in relation to Muslims, although the Russian officials themselves recognized that they were not even that influential. And up to 1907, some of the leaders immigrated to Turkey, and as they even claimed that Russian Muslim population was not even prepared for all these ideas of socialism and nationalism, and they were not dangerous. The movement was not dangerous yet as the Polish and the Jewish question, so they were the most dangerous questions so far, but potentially Muslim question could develop along the same lines. So there was this constant look to the West, and I think that there was more of a transfer of fear and to potential direction in which Muslims could go, even though they haven't gone so far. That's what I
The
found.
component of that fear is that in both cases there's this collapse between religion and ethnicity that is actually really problematic on the ground.
Yeah, and that's why it was extremely interesting for me to read your paper, because I dealt mostly with Russian perceptions of the situation in the Western borderlands. I also looked at the publication by Aksakov, who actually didn't write much on the Muslim question. He was mostly preoccupied with the Polish question and with the Jewish question.
Okay, perhaps we can find any info, just to make sure that there's enough time for Roy and discussion.
I feel like there was an artificial end to that. Apologize, I'll take advantage of it. So I'm going to hand around my handy-dandy thing. This is the chart, which I'm inordinately proud.
You created another book.
What?
The time you spent in this, you wrote a book.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's when, in fact, I spent enough time that, yes, I think much of the, yes, the present book could have been written when I was doing this, yeah. So, but as is appropriate to the last paper on the last panel, the last day, I'll be as brief as I can in the comments, and then we can go on with the discussion. So the basic idea here was to take something that I am relatively intimately involved with, which is sort of the lived religion of the belief, and ask a kind of political question, right? And I have to say, it's not one that I generally thought about. So my thanks to this collective for making me think again in some of these issues. And in fact, some of this material was I found originally during my dissertation work, so a really long time ago. And also thanks to James West, who has this little sort of this kind of interesting niche that he studies. He's at Trinity in Connecticut, and he's really interested in this group that he calls the neo-believers. It's actually not my term, but his. This sort of the most liberal, very wealthy wing of the old belief, that sort of, but Aboshinsky circle, that was what he calls it, right? And so putting together some information I had and the structures or the constructs of this meeting and James West stuff, it occurred to me that there is a rather general problem after 1905 that I had never thought about, really. And that is, can this group that is relatively well identified, in that it identifies itself as a group, the old believers, right? That it self-identifies, and that the state perceives as a group, the old believers. Can this group transform itself into a political movement, into a mass political movement? And that, in fact, was precisely what this group, the Aboshinsky Circle, was trying to do, right? They were trying to take this idea of the old belief and create a movement that would then push old believer goals in the Duma and elsewhere, right? So this brings up a couple of questions. The first was, are the old believers a group? Is there a thing called the old belief? Or, as I would have asked, or I would have said, 10 years ago, are there many old beliefs, right? When we were pluralizing everything. Well, yes and no. I mean, there are old beliefs. There are many, many different kinds. But there is, I think, one can argue, a certain way of looking at the world, a certain intercommunication that is particularly old believer. Not only old believer, but it is particularly so. Bob Crumby's work on this, I think, has been absolutely great. And he posits the old belief as a textual community, right? As groups of people who understand each other through their relationship to a certain set of texts. And I think that's dead on. I think that's an extremely apt way to understand the old belief. That means that it can come and go, it can move, it can change, but that there is sort of a reality that the world makes sense. And I would add to that an important piece to my mind, which is that it's not only text, but it is ritual, right? It is ritual related to text. So one knows that you're an old believer by the way that you stand in church, by the way you make the sign of the cross, by the way you read the canons, by the way you dress or cut your hair. You know, all of these things are ritual actions that point out to other old believers that you're one of them, right? So you can have a lot of different ideas about what it means to be an old believer, but there are some sort of core things that it seems to me link them one to another. That was the idea, right, that these neo-old believers started with, right? That even though we are a very diverse group, that there is something about us that is unified. We are all old believers, right? And because of that, this group of highly intellectual, incredibly wealthy, very thoughtful, extremely erudite, very sophisticated folks, decided that they could sort of create this thing that would become an old believer movement, a mass political old believer movement, and they failed. So my question is just why? Why does this fail? And looking at what they were trying to do, I think there were three basic ideas. One was to unify the old belief through publishing after 1905, right? So if you look at the Nadieszda press, or the company, he had a number of different kinds of old believer publications, each developed with a very specific point, right? We're going to speak to this group now, we're going to speak to that group there, we're going to speak to this other group, and then there was one sort of journal that was supposed to be the single pan old believer journal. It sort of was extremely neutral, never said anything negative about any other group, never any other old believer group. See, the idea there, right, was that if you had all of these different publications, you would find a way to sort of bring everyone together. You would find a way to speak to all of the old believers in different ways, and therefore unify them. The second thrust, right, to this group was, or this neo-old believer group, was to push the old belief and what they saw as old believer concerns and needs and desires in the Duma, right, through the old believer bill. Unlike Obamacare, it did not ever become law, and so there was no need to worry about the funding it. But it was brought up a number of times, right? It made it furthest, as I described in the paper, in the third Duma, but even there, it ended up never actually turning into law. So it got relatively far. There was a conference committee to get together and write the bill, and they actually put it together. But it broke down in part because of what the old believers really were, right? So anti-old believer bill folks, mostly those folks who felt a certain allegiance to the state church, to the Russian Orthodox Church, right? They were very open in saying, well, why should we have this old believer bill that we're going to give them even more rights than they have now when they're calling the government Antichrist, right? And the Albany were saying,
We're back.
right. It's just a few of them out there and stuff here. Just for you. Right. But the truth of the matter is, of course, this is a huge issue for the old believers, right? So there were old believers who completely accepted the state and everything that it implied, not necessarily that they agreed with it, right? Nadieszda was very liberal, and the rightist press saw him as a great lover of Jews. That, of course, meant he was, he was Antichrist, right? There's this great line that he, during during the case, you know, that we've been talking about today, in which he says, you know, if Jews had really been wanting Christians to kill, right, the government would have given them old believer babies to do it, right? But oddly enough, nobody ever asked, right? The Jews never wanted it. So, I have to say, it's just like, and I was, you know, like, I'm not expecting a lot of humor from the old believers. I was really impressed. Anyway, it was great. Anyway, so you know, it didn't mean that he was in favor of the monarchy, right? But he was in favor of a central Russian government, right? And it was, and you know, for instance, when you know, they celebrated the 300th anniversary, you know, they did all of this sort of appropriate things, even though they were very critical of much of what's going on. But that was not the case with everyone, right? There were other people who understood the need to accept the, you know, sort of the Romans saying, we have to accept that there is this government. But you don't have to like it, right? So there were other old believers who, when they prayed for the Tsar, would pray for his forgiveness, right? May God forgive the Tsar. I mean, of course, to me, that sounds exactly like, you know, is there a prayer for the Tsar, right? May God keep the Tsar far away from us, right? And in fact, this is a sidebar, but American believers loved the Roman. They completely saw themselves in that situation, absolutely identified with it. It's fascinating. So there were these people who were kind of in the middle. It's like, you know, the whole world is anti-Christian, but here we are stuck living in it, so we got to do what we got to do. And then there were other world believers, right, who were even further out, and off theologically, ideologically, politically, and also usually geographically, who said, no, we don't buy into any of it, right? We don't want to be numbered in the books of the Antichrist by being in the census. We won't use money with the picture of the Antichrist, which is the Tsar, on it. We won't, you know, we will do nothing that is related to the state. And those folks, although relatively small in number, were surprisingly important as a sort of reminder of what the most extreme position might be, right? So these Bedouini or Straniki, there might only be a few of them, but there were lots of people helping them out, right? So it was very typical that you would be an old believer and you would do things for the Straniki, you would do things for the Bedouini, right? You would make sure they had food, you would buy things for them, so they wouldn't have to do that stuff that interacted with the state, knowing that they would be praying for you, and knowing that at some point in the future, maybe after your kids are gone and you know whatever, then you go off and you do that too, right? So the point here simply is that in this group of neo-old believers' perception of the old belief and their desire to unify the old belief, which they wanted to do under their own, they didn't want to create something new, they wanted all the other old believers to come into their group, right, into their organization, which is problematic. But in their desire to do that, they really highlighted for other people in the government, especially in the anti-old believers in the Duma, this idea that there were a whole bunch of old believers that didn't agree with the Grabowshinsky faction, if you will, right? That didn't agree with this kind of modernizing, you know, easy on the eyes old believer, right? These were people who were much more extreme. And that ultimately this project, right, this neo-old believer project, failed, I think, because of that. Because while there was something to be called an old belief, and there were people who, and, you know, you could go out and say, oh yeah, there's one, and they would talk to them. And you could identify people as old believers. That did not mean that there was any unified idea about what the old belief was, and that the interaction among religious ideas, political ideas, and social ideas was such that it made this kind of unification impossible. So if we were to go for a moment just to this thing, I was proud of it because I get a lot of information on this picture. So basically what you see, right, is that in order to agree to have a mass old believer political movement, you needed to A, right, be integrated into society, and B, you need to accept secular authority, right, as a religious thing. Right? This was a religious question. You know, so this was it was a political question, but it was also a clearly religious question, right? So to the extent that you were integrated into Russian society, and to the extent that you accepted the idea of secular authority, and also to the extent that you had money, right, as the Krasnitsky and Krasniki did, if you had all of those things, you were likely, therefore, to be interested and willing to sort of support a mass old believer political project. However, if you, as you moved away from any of those things, right, so if you became more segregated, more self-segregated, if you rejected the state more, if you were poorer, or one could argue probably also if you were moving eastward into Siberia, right, that the likelihood of your accepting any sort of, wanting to be part of any sort of mass old believer political project became less and less likely, right? And in fact, I think then that the project failed in large part because what these neo-old believers perceived to be the old belief was a rather narrow vision that was their own, but was only one of many intersecting visions of what it meant to be an old believer in, say, 1913 in Russia.
If you'll allow me, Roy, perhaps, well, actually, we can have one question, and then we'll go on to Chuck, and then, all right, fine. And then, I'll be like the fourth dude, fine.
And we see what happened there, right?
No, I just wanted to ask more specifically about this chart. What are the criteria that determine placement on various axes? In other words, what makes the Porter-Szucs less segregated than their counterparts to the left here?
Only I know that, and I'm not going to tell you. Right, so basically, right, the idea here, right, is that the Filipowski, for example, is a good example, were part of the Pomorci Soglasya, except that they said, we refuse to pray for the Tsar, right? So that, for me, put them towards, and they tended to segregate themselves, right? The Begunia, the Sananiki, said we won't pray for the Tsar, we won't use the Tsar's money, we won't be involved at all. The Pomorci were very much the sort of centrist group in that they were like, we want to be part of Russia, but we don't like it so much. Well, I'll give you a great example. In the Pomorci, they were the ones who said, you know, the prayer for the Tsar was, may God forgive the Tsar. But the Pomorci, you would go out and you would live your life in regular society, but when you went into church, before you began praying, you did a separate set of prayers asking forgiveness of the community for having been in the world. Right? And you didn't take part in the service until you had done that. Right? So you went in the back, right, in the back of the church, and you like tapped on somebody's shoulder, and then one of the Nadieszda or something would come back. This is say service had started or whatever, and you would say these prayers together, right? Then, for example, if you it's a longer answer than you want, I know. But say you then say that was a Saturday afternoon. You just went home. You were with everybody at home. You came back on Sunday morning. You wouldn't have to do those prayers again. Why? Because you hadn't had any.
You hadn't had time to defile yourself.
Precisely.
You did all the circle.
Yeah. So those were the kinds of things that made me set it up that way. Yeah.
Did you want to do the second question before we go on to chat?
Your mind is in 8 parts. Right. So it begins with the fundamental laws, right? It's not really 8 parts. So it begins with the fundamental laws. So freedom of conscience, right? And no one is quite sure what this would mean in practice. beginning with government officials who go through all sorts of somersaults trying to figure out how to interpret it.
Of course.
Because it's new to them as well.
Yeah.
And so you can find these papki in the archives, these files in the archives, where they're addressing this problem with regard to all sorts of different confessions.
Of course, yeah.
So, and this is actually a question that I have for all three of the speakers in this last panel, which was, what does freedom of conscience mean in practice in the empire? And so, the one interpretation, just to put it in broad strokes, was that freedom of conscience means that the government will not be concerned with your religion, period. Right? But there's another part of the government which interprets it to mean that no, now we're going to be more concerned than ever with your religion. Right? And both of them could be good news or bad news depending on how you look at things, right? So that's the first question. And I think it's something to seriously confront, and I haven't seen it treated well. What does freedom of conscience mean?
Well, and for the old belief, at least in the press, they very clearly differentiated between what they believed was the situation in 1905, which was the toleration of other religions. But what was to be the old believer bill was going to enshrine freedom of conscience.
Okay, well this is what leads to the next part, which deals with the old believers in particular. There's different ways to be free and different ways to be emancipated, right? So one of them was, let us be in our own communities, our own seat, leave us alone. That's what freedom of conscience is, right? So just leave us alone, stay away. But the other one was, no, freedom of conscience is a principle, and this is Nadieszda, which should apply to everybody.
Yes.
And in defending my rights, I'm actually defending everybody's rights. Which then leads to that third thing about Nadieszda, and this is what West's work is all about, really, and makes it so interesting. Nadieszda is saying, as an old believer, I'm emblematic of something much bigger than just an old believer. And so, as an old believer, it fails, obviously. But as a bourgeois, wealthy, liberal, financier, and a leader of a political movement, the progressists, he does very well. In the 1912 elections, these guys do extremely well. And the Moscow mayoral elections and all of these things. And so there he had more success. But what he was saying at that point was that as an old believer, I represent something bigger than just old believers. I'm emblematic of a new kind of Russia, a renewal, in other words.
Well, right, and the renewal is the really important part, right? Because Nadieszda, he goes on and writes about this in quite some length. I never read it, it seems so boring. But he goes on to say, the old believers are Russia. We are emblematic of what Russia ought to have been, right? And so to the extent that we can renew the old belief, we can offer an orthodox society that doesn't have all of the problems in it. So, he was very clear that he wanted to do that, right? He saw himself both as an old believer and a liberal. He saw no problem with those things.
And a bourgeois.
And a bourgeois, absolutely, right? And I think that he very much thought of his identity was based on his tradition, right? On his old believer tradition. So I think that not everyone shared that idea, right? But I think that he was very consistent with that.
Yeah. It seems to me that every religion is to be confronting these questions, post-1905.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. There are a lot of things to say about these excellent papers, and I'm really going to try to not say the things that I want to say. To the extent because I really enjoy this discussion, and I want to get out of the way. But I did want to come to the title of our panel, Mass Politics, for short, and then come back to where we started today on the Bayless case. Because I think mass politics is central here. And although I'm very convinced of the particular importance after 1905, I would argue, I think you see a lot of this in the newspaper, I think a lot alike, that this really comes out of the 1860s. That what mass politics, more than anything, means is the participation of a lot of people in politics. And this is what differentiates it from old regime politics, when you can have just a few people around the czar and then everybody else obeys. Once you make that move from obeying, relying on people obeying, to participating, then the game changes entirely. And I think if you look at the great reforms, what's crucial, to me, the crucial principle that unites them is this shift from passivity that's expected under the old order to active, I guess I would still say subject, not citizen. Then you see this in exempts for local self-government, where the participants are elected, granted in kind of a particular way, but they're supposed to participate in, they're supposed to internalize, they're supposed to help make decisions, which means they have to understand and really ideally embrace the values of the regime. Jury trials, the judicial reform, subjects who know the law and can apply it. Universal military service operations, men have to, everybody has to fight, and everybody has to know, all these men anyway are supposed to know why they fight. Education is essential to this, and this is why I think it figures so prominently in Elena's work. That is, the perception that Muslims were alienated didn't matter much before 1855, 1863, whatever, because they're supposed to obey. And if we can engage their elites, then the elites can take care of, as Bob's shown, and I can show a little love back to Bob for all he's given me. That is, if we can work through these elites to work down into the masses, but as long as we have this sort of older approach, then that's really what we need. Well, after the Great Reforms, this changes in that there are many more people who are supposed to know and supposed to participate. And I think that there are three key ways that this changes the game. And I think, conveniently, each of the papers, although they discuss all three, each focuses in particular on one of the ways. The first idea, I think, is that the mass politics changes the way the government relates to religious institutions and their flocks. That is, once you have a notion afoot that although the czar is still sovereign, the ideas, wishes, desires, or at least interest of the people has to be attracted, that changes how you address the faithful. And I think that Brian's work particularly addresses this sort of phenomenon, where we see him, is obviously fascinating to me, and to see how supportive of authority, legitimate authority, the Polish church was. I mean, I sort of, not be ignorant of the details, saw that this would be, combative, they would support the Polish national. Well, what we see there, I think, is a real, a real, the way that this, throughout the empire in each different confessional group, there's a process of redefinition that has to take place. That is, the confessional leaders are now put in a position where they have their sort of authority that has often, as Bob has shown, has buttressed their authority if you're talking about the Muslim ecclesiastical establishment. And now, but we also have to be responding to the people below. And so how do we make that, how do we negotiate that? And I think your paper shows really well this moment in the Polish case where there's a real transition to, to this newer, to looking at mass politics as a way of realizing the church's mission rather than looking to legitimate authority. My question to you would be, to what, and I think someone kind of got at this, so forgive me if I'm repeating, but to what extent does this change the way the Polish hierarchy addresses the Tsar, the imperial government? I really don't know the answer to that. I'd just be curious if it does, because I think in Bob's work, which is different parts of the empire primarily, and in places that are part of, or confessions that are part of the Ministry of Foreign Faiths, which, as I understand it, the Poles are not, right? They're administered out of Warsaw, the bishopric of Warsaw. I'm asking, or guessing.
You mean within the...
Right, that they're not subordinate to the Ministry of Internal Affairs Department Oddziela, what Ministrony Piscovitani. I think that's the true...
Most Poles try not to pay attention to that.
Right. I think there is probably that's interesting. So I think that this is one key access, and certainly we see that in Elena's work, but I think what her work does an excellent job at is show another process of redefinition that all religious groups in this new context had to deal with, and that's a question of the other confessions. In a way that with the earlier confessional order, things, there was never rivalry, but there's a way in which there was a sort of a hierarchy that was more understood and maybe more accepted, that is called into question here. And I think what you show in your paper, this powerful feelings of someone like Ilminsky and Bishop Andre versus, the Jadids, where in some cases you see this sort of hostility to the Jadids, which is much more than it is to, more traditional Muslims, who some would argue are actually much of the majority. That is, you really see a process by which different confessions, different religious institutions have to renegotiate the lines with, the boundaries with one another. That I think your paper shows particularly well. And the third is the way mass politics, by making believers, imposing on them a sort of burden really of knowing their faith. I mean, you see this all over, in Andre's writing about the Baptist in Ufa. He writes page after page about how wonderful the Baptists know their faith, and there's this old woman who got sent a spy to a Baptist meeting and then reported it was just an ecstasy, and wrote page after page. They're all going to hell, but man, this woman could really defend her faith, and it was really impressive. That is, I think there's a sense that the lines are redrawn within each of these confessions, and this is what I see particularly in Roy's paper. That is where once the sort of catalytic effect of mass politics plays out, we suddenly have old believer groups that we didn't know existed before. And in some cases, we had groups that might have seemed to be a textual community saying, well, wait a minute, I don't recognize what you say as what I believe. That is, there's a sort of a way that within confessions, I mean, I think you see this in the tension between older and new styles of Islam as well. That is, and these sort of tensions that participation brings with it can be very, can be very powerful and very destabilizing. So I think that when I sat down to think about, page after page, when I sat down to think about this topic, when I young proposed the idea that I commented, I started to think first, what's my first encounter with accusations of ritual murder came at breakfast in the spring of 1995. Because I was working in Ufa, and apartments in Ufa were difficult to find, but there was a woman who was a kandidat naub, who was the widow of a zon mayor of the city, who was my landlady, and I rented a room for her, a nice apartment very close to the archive. And I had been out the night before, had a little bit to drink. Not a lot, but those of you who know me. And so she expressed concern the next morning that I shouldn't be out so late, and that she worried about me. And I said, no, that's okay, my friends are that's all right, don't worry about it. She said, well, I never let my children go out, on the street. I didn't let them go out much at night. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, Jews kill Christian children and, for blood, sacrifice for Christian children. And I said, excuse me? And, what struck me about this...
Sober up thing.
Sober up.
That'll get you over
We're wondering how much you actually did have to drink.
And so what I come back to with this story, here's a woman who was ethnically Russian, born in the Kuban, but, and her grandmother had baptized her covertly, but didn't know much about it, didn't really have any, as far as I could tell, sense of religious doctrine, education, any of the kind of, the literature from even the parts of the empire where this was practiced, for whom this was lively enough under, in Brezhnev's Russia that this could be something that you took seriously. And so I really think that, I really think it comes back to the political role of these kinds of accusations. That is, why is it that we see something like the Vier's case? That is, we see, this comes at a time in the early 20th century when mass politics had introduced an all-imperial contest for political authority that was disruptive of relations between the ruler and the ruled. That it brought a sense of rivalry and competition among different confessions, a need to really mark off boundaries, and a greater sense of demands on those who are within the faith to make the right choices and promote the faith. And so I think that it's no accident that that this trial comes at a moment when the religious leaders of all types, or at least the Catholic, Russian Orthodox, and Muslims, Roger believer too, had come to question and redefine the relationship with the monarchy. That is, had made the monarchy, I think, insecure to a point that it felt it had to connect with this mass of hard right followers who the Tsar and people who would consider real Russians. It came at a time when there was the need perceived to really mark off boundaries, to divide off this Jewish community as fanatic, as somehow unreliable, and therefore that this was justified. And in some, it made sense for Tsarist officials to pursue allegations of ritual murder that had been repudiated by Alexander I in 1817, when politics were not mass. And I'll leave it.
Just, you should have told the woman that that you're too old for.
I was a
Well,
young man
maybe
at
you're
the
Jewish,
time.
and then you would have really.
I'm not Jewish.
You had to get tracks.
Which, yeah.
They only think
Sorry, I was a younger man then.
If I could just respond, I hadn't really thought of this until you started posing this question, but I double checked, and yes, this session is called Mass Politics, and I actually did, I wrote about modern politics, and it only now that I realize that I think we probably need to make a distinction here between those two terms, because I really wasn't talking about mass politics. The church, okay, maybe I was. The Catholics have no problem with mass politics, in a sense, of any sense. The involvement of the people in political life, that's okay. It's modern politics that creates a problem. What I mean by that is that this idea that the conception of what political life was supposed to be about, and the Lincolnian phrase from the people, by the people, for the people, or whatever that is, American. That's bad, and that remains bad. Because if politics is directed towards the people and emanates from the people, and if that's what politics is about, then it's not about God anymore. And that's a big problem, right? But the idea of having more or less people involved in politics, more or fewer, people involved in politics, I mean, that's just a question of, how you organize your state. So they could make that transition relatively smoothly if you started to think about the politics differently. I mean, many liberals already, John Stuart Mill, right, believed in a politics of modernity that was aimed at the people and involved 6% of the people having to vote, right? Or whatever it was in England at that time, 8%. That's perfectly fine because you want to guard against the tyranny of the majority, but we speak on behalf of the people, and our politics is aimed at the people. That we want to have, and that's a different thing, and shifting attitudes of the Roman Catholic hierarchy towards political life didn't change their position towards the Tsar one bit. Mostly because the big changes didn't come until the First World War and the years afterwards. But certainly even in 19, in those last few years, 1910, 11, 12, Przegląd Katolicki, which is the main Warsaw Catholic periodical, continued to print even official statements about the Tsar's health, at a time when no other Warsaw newspaper bothered, and they would verbatim print these proclamations from the Tsar at a time when no other Warsaw paper, left, right, or center did so. So they didn't change.
With your background, sort of the first point that you were making, just to push on this issue, you're probably right about the distinction between mass and modern politics. But it raises a question for both you and Elena, which is that I think we have a prejudice that when we're looking for a mass politics and mass mobilizations, we have to look outside of the state. Does it make sense actually to look at the state as in its own right a locus of mobilization?
Sure.
And so that when we're looking at, for example, even something as specific as the Davis case, right? The Shiglovizov, as part of what he's doing is he's trying to mobilize opinion and mobilize prejudice and mobilize things in the state rather than having them out in the streets. You see. So when you're speaking, for example, about how you're understanding Muslims within the Russian Empire, and combine your work with Bob's work and then with Chuck's work, and you begin to realize that the state's being used as an instrument for implicating people in the business of government, implicating people in sort of organizing and mobilizing and transforming, but it's in the state, it's not outside, which is a useful way to think about it. Although I want to congratulate everybody on your books. All three of you have books out or coming out, am I right? Your book is on Defining as a Survey of Polish History.
Yeah, out in January as well.
Congratulations.
Mm-hmm.
Elena, your
And the
book?
Muslim question, and Russia's imperial
And when is it coming out?
2014 should be now
Congratulations.
copy at stage.
Congratulations. And Chuck's book is coming out next year, right?
Yeah, probably.
It's funny that you asked the question that way because I've had experience of being in a gathering where most of the people were historians of Western Europe, and that they expressed surprise that we're focusing entirely on mass mobilization outside the state, because it is the state that mobilizes nationalism, right? If you're a French historian, if you're a German historian,
That's the great divide.
yeah, and yeah.
No, I just wanted to comment on the distinction between mass versus modern. You seem to have reduced it to a question of numbers in the eyes of the church, whereas I think what Chuck was talking about was people taking responsibility and asserting authority in different aspects of life. And if one does that and is not subject to the authority of the church in making those decisions, that creates a problem.
That does, and that's what I'm thinking of as a sort of modern form of this. You can have lots of people involved in political life, lots of and that might mean nothing. So that's why I was saying.
Sure, if you have 10,000 soldiers or 100,000 soldiers marching to the same orders, right, then you'd rather have 100,000.
Exactly, right. Or you can, yeah, exactly so, right. And you can have uprisings, right? You can have peasant revolts, which is a form of mass politics that might not have anything to do with a reconceptualization of the nature of politics.
Yeah, but
I agree.
You agree, but I don't think the difference here is all that great. What you're calling modern politics is a lot about what you're calling mass politics, which really is.
That was my feeling, but I think when I go back and look, I do know you just say modern, but that elsewhere, there really is a participatory element, and I think that, and it's not, I struggle with it because it's not, government of the people, by the people, for the people. I mean, that's not what we're seeing effective, but that there's a way that of kind of responsibility that people take, are supposed to take, and it's not everyone, but that this is something that to me is distinctive. Now, I don't know if it's modern only or
So actually, something you just said, Yanni, was very helpful to me, and an idea that has been percolating for a long time, and is now sort of coming out of my ears in some ways. But it's related to this idea of citizen versus subject, right? And it occurs to me that I think part of what these projects are, the Muslim question or mass politics, sort of bringing people in, is indeed this idea that we want people involved in the state, right? We want people involved in this in the process. We want to control that, right? But it also occurs to me that maybe it makes sense, at least for some people in Russia, not to think about it as moving from being a subject to being a citizen, but rather that the people who the state perceived as subjects thought of themselves just as sort of out doing their thing, independent of the state, and in fact, not really giving a shit, not caring very much about what the state did, right? I'll give you an example. In 1954, the Soviets had come into Riga, they had reestablished their control, and there's this great scene among the old believers in Riga, I think it's 54, in which they say it's clear that we are our own masters. The Soviets are not our masters. And what they meant by that is we have complete control of our ritual life. That they don't really care. And as long as they don't care, they don't control what it is that we find important, we don't really care about them either. And I think that there's a way that's what's happening is not that the state saw these people as subjects, but they didn't always see them as subjects. They were just doing their thing.
Have you read Inga Flandinen, Ambiguous Conquest?
No.
Well, it's precisely about the Spanish conquest and how, according to the Spaniards, they conquered.
Right.
But according to the native population, they'd never been conquered because, by their standards, they'd never been conquered.
Yeah.
The Spanish never addressed what they thought was important.
Or closer to home, Cape Brown's work, which really makes this is all about the process of the states coming in and telling people you're part of a state,
Right.
and start thinking like that.
Yeah.
And that's a traumatic thing.
And in a way, this sort of the Muslim question is part of that too, right? Like, go be Muslims like we want you to be Muslims, and they're like, no. Here I just thought it was being me, right? I didn't know that I was a subject.
Yeah, but sorry.
No, go ahead.
But I think that goes too far in sort of accepting the way people describe their own situation as the reality of the situation. That they may think they can separate themselves from the state, and they can to a certain degree in certain realms, but they obviously can't in many other realms. And I don't know if this works for the case of the old believers in particular, but the state is also defined, certainly by the time we're in the mid-20th century, the state is also defining the structures within which people can even think that they can distance themselves from the state. So, I think Chuck's point about once you open up institutions to participation, then you essentially have lost control. Even from the 1860s onward, you don't know what's going to happen, and the dynamic changes in ways that the regime then has to wrestle with for decades. And I think we see that pattern in many cases.
You could put that exactly the opposite way. Once you demand involvement in the state, you have opened yourself up to forms of state control that you can never unravel. In other words, it's a dynamic that works. It can be perceived both as a sort of losing of control, but also a new forms of subordination as well, which I think we really do see in this case of many rural areas throughout Eastern Europe, where the involvement, the emergence of these new forms of political life force people to think like a state, and it's not something that turns out to be what they always wanted to do.
Yeah, that's for sure. In a way, I think it's kind of like it's like these folks were thinking about themselves under the Mongol yoke, right? In which, okay, well, we do our own things, we give them money once in a while, and then they don't kill us. Yeah. Right? But modern politics doesn't let that happen.
You can't do that anymore.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the 20th century that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's the
late 20th century. Yeah.
We're done. So she's an alien transcendent. She's ubiquitous. She really is a theological figure who actually makes everything happen here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.